Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine Matthews, and I'm the Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. Welcome and thank you for attending tonight's talk. I also want to thank our friends at Hubtown Tours for their support of the Old North Digital Speaker Series. At Old North, we are committed to sharing the stories of all the people and communities that are part of our site's physical, spiritual, and social history. The Old North Church sits on land that was once the land of the Massachusetts people. By the time Old North was built in 1723, the Massachusetts people had been driven and displaced from their homes, but they did not disappear, nor should their stories and memories. We have two wonderful in-person events coming up. First of all, Revolution's Edge, the critically acclaimed original play, is returning to Old North this summer for a 10-week run beginning on June 7th. Revolution's Edge is a plays-in-place production written by Patrick Gaybridge and directed by Alexandra Smith. The play takes us back to the afternoon of April 18th, 1775, just hours before the lantern signal in Old North Steeple will set off events that culminated in the battles of Lexington and Concord. Tickets are available on our website. And then on Saturday, June 15th, Old North Illuminated and the National Park Service are co-sponsoring an Egun ancestor procession at Copp's Hill Burying Ground with local artist Ife Franklin. Egun ancestor processions are, in the words of Ife Franklin, beautiful community rituals that honor the lives of the enslaved whose burial sites are often forgotten. Each journey offers a healing balm to heavy hearts that are grappling with the difficult history of enslavement. These spaces are a place to share love and respect for those who endured a life of forced servitude. We gather to pray, sing, dance, wail, and shout as we hold the old souls in the highest regard. We create spaces filled with deep appreciation, beauty, and integrity. That event will run from 2 to 5 p.m. And tonight, we welcome Professor Crystal Nicole Edens for a talk about the Haitian Revolution. In 1791, the eruption of the Haitian Revolution shook the world. It was the only revolt of enslaved people to abolish slavery and create a free and independent Black nation in the Americas. Even though enslaved women represented nearly half of colonial Haiti's plantation populations, their voices have been largely absent from the archival record. Tonight, Professor Edens will draw on African and African diaspora perspectives to shed light on the ways that enslaved women may have contributed to the revolution for freedom and liberation. Crystal Nicole Edens is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research has been supported by the Ruth J. Simmons Postdoctoral Fellowship, the John Carter Brown Library, and the National Science Foundation. She is the author of Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, Collective Action in the African Diaspora. So with that, I'll remind you to put your questions in the chat, mute your microphones, and enjoy tonight's program. Crystal, it's all up to you.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. Let's see. Please 1 second. Okay, I'd also like to obviously thank Old North Illuminated and Catherine Matthews for putting this event together to talk about the important yet somewhat elusive topic of unsilencing women during the Haitian Revolution. Can everyone hear me okay? I think my neighbor's doing some yard work. I've got the pup in my lap, but am I sounding all right? Yeah.
You sound great.
Okay, so one of the reasons for my fascination with this topic, I think started with my own questions about the role that Black women and religion especially play in social change. As a young Black American woman from a predominantly Black working class community on the south side of Ypsilanti, Michigan, And as a student at Michigan State University, I came to learn that the histories and the lived reality of poor and working class Black Americans was deeply tied to the transatlantic slave trade, plantation slavery in the South, and the Great Migration. Growing up in a religious household where women were, like my mother and my grandmother, were pillars of their family, I perceived women as indispensable within Black culture and Black institutions. So I began to look to other parts of the African diaspora for similar histories and patterns, and to learn more about how women and religion influenced collective efforts for social change and transformation. When I learned about the Haitian Revolution, I was captivated, not only because it was the most successful slave uprising in modern history, and not just because of the military genius and might of male leaders like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Rather, it was Cécile Fatiman, the Mambo priestess who led the Bois Cayman ceremony 1 week prior to the August 1791 insurrection, who embodied my curiosities about women, religion, and the revolution. At the ceremonial meeting, Fatiman, along with Boukman Dutty, and delegates representing the enslaved masses from plantations across Haiti's northern plain, plotted the demise of the sugar plantation economy and outlined the terms of their liberation. The revolutionaries called upon the spiritual strength of West and West Central African deities to empower them to avenge the wrongs of slavery and colonialism and the harsh realities of unrepentant violence and unprecedented deaths that upheld the plantation system. Today, there is some acknowledgement and understanding among Haitian people about the centrality of women and the importance of women in Haitian history and in Haitian society contemporarily. The image that you see on the right is of a Haitian Goud banknote from 2004. Which was the 200th anniversary of the Haitian Declaration of Independence. This piece of currency prominently figures a woman named Sanité Belair. Sanité was executed during the last days of the Leclerc expedition of October 1804, alongside her husband, Charles Belair, who was nephew of Toussaint Louverture. Sanité was known for her fearlessness and refusal to be blindfolded during the execution. So I think this banknote is an example of how women in the Haitian Revolution are indeed remembered today, but albeit in ways that might require unique methods of analysis to comprehend. Haitian historians like Bayeda Bello draw on oral traditions to elevate women fighters like Tante Toya Montu, an aunt of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who may have been a member of the Dahomean Women's Army. Still, few, if any, full-length English language doctoral dissertations or books about enslaved women in colonial Haiti and their actions during the Haitian Revolution have been written. So there's a few important things to know about Haiti and its historical significance. Haiti is the western third of the island of the small island of Hispaniola, which I've highlighted within the red circle. Haiti was first inhabited by 5 indigenous Taino kingdoms until Christopher Columbus and Spanish colonizers arrived in the 1490s and coerced the indigenous people into a brutal labor regime. Many of the Taino died due to disease, overwork, and genocide, and the Spanish quickly replaced them with enslaved Africans. Haiti was the first place in the Americas to receive enslaved Africans as laborers, who then quickly staged a revolt in 1591. The French later arrived in 1697 and brought with them an intensified sugar and coffee industry that's relied solely on enslaved labor and made Haiti the wealthiest slave colony in the Americas. As Africans were brought to the island against their will, their numbers swelled to nearly 500,000 in 1789, while the white and mixed race populations were less than 30,000 each. The Haitian Revolution began as a slave uprising in 1791 and became the only revolt in the Americas to successfully abolish slavery and overturn French colonialism, with the Haitians declaring themselves independent from France in 1804. It was an even more radical political event than either the American or French revolutions, neither of which abolished slavery or gave freedom, citizenship, or political rights to people of African descent before the Haitian uprising. Therefore, the Haitian Revolution is an important symbol of anti-racist, anti-slavery, and anti-colonial struggle throughout the African diaspora and the formerly colonized world. Scholars like Haitian anthropologist Michel Rothtriot, American historian Marisa Fuentes, and professor of English Sadia Hartman have turned our attention to the mechanisms of how history is written based on the things that our historical archives do or don't say. So we must understand that most of the remaining records of the transatlantic slave trade, enslavement in the Americas, and even enslaved people's resistance actions were written by enslavers in account books, slave rosters, runaway slave advertisements, travelers' accounts, and plantation records. These materials upheld the bureaucratic and managerial dimensions of slavery. And these records reflect and are deeply embedded in slave owners and slave traders' financial interests in slavery and their racist biases and ways of thinking about Black people. Enslaved people's resistance is one area where archival documents are often intentionally biased against those who were attempting to free themselves from bondage and oppression. Since most enslaved people did not leave behind records of their own, their intentionality, the ways they understood and navigated the world, and their attempts to free themselves are not fully represented in archival documents. Similarly, women, enslaved Black women, especially, were written out of archives as well as their fullest expressions of themselves, their modes of being, and their forms of resistance, leaving us few clues as to how they lived their lives. There are, however, for example, fictional accounts that do help to bring to life the stories of women in colonial Haiti. Both the infamous Rosalie by Evelyn Trujillo and Isabel Allende's Island Beneath the Sea give narratives of young enslaved girls who were involved in rebel communities, in some cases marginally, but involved nonetheless, within these communities that foreshadowed and supported the Haitian Revolution. In both books, we see young women navigate their world and encounter clandestine networks that eventually made up the revolutionary force. These networks were composed of enslaved people and runaway Maroons who helped to organize the masses of enslaved people across various plantations, as well as ritual leaders who used their spiritual tools and technologies to invoke the power of African deities to strengthen and protect rebels in warfare. So today I want to spend time kind of talking about particularly how African and African diaspora perspectives can help us fill in the gaps and create a broader picture of what women's experiences and their contributions most likely looked like during the revolutionary process. Then I'll discuss a few women who are noted in archival histories of the Haitian Revolution, the various roles they played, and the ways that we can use this knowledge to better understand and center women today. Black women have a long history of surviving systems that subject them to racial oppression and economic and sexual exploitation. These patterns of oppression are rooted in the transatlantic slave trade that forced over 12 million Africans to the Americas between the late 15th and 19th centuries. Haiti was once the most prosperous colony in the Americas, with over the course of the slave trade, receiving nearly 800,000 Africans, approximately 60% of whom were male. Some historians estimate that nearly 1/3 of those newly arrived Africans died within 5 years from starvation, overwork, brutality, or disease. As the 18th century sugar plantation economy boomed, planters increasingly viewed women as a source of physical and reproductive labor to increase crop productivity as well as fertility rates. Colonial Haiti's conditions were so deadly that the enslaved population could not reproduce itself, leading planters to continually replace dead laborers with new African-born captives. The French statute on slavery, the Code Noir, specified that any child of an enslaved woman automatically belonged to her owner, which ensured that slavery would remain a generational, lifelong condition. Cedric Robinson has argued that the transatlantic slave trade flattened and erased ethnic, cultural, religious, political, and linguistic distinctions and identities among African captives, reducing them to an expendable labor pool and source of capital. Similarly, we can argue that the processes of commodification reduced African women to their enslaved women and reproductive capacities. This flattening of their humanity to workers and childbearers not only failed to acknowledge their cultural identities, but also the robust roles and responsibilities that women held in various pre-colonial African societies as healers, soldiers, queens and queen mothers, religious leaders, agriculturalists, midwives, so on and so forth. As historian Jennifer Morgan has argued, enslavers widely throughout the Atlantic world sought to use reproduction to advance economic development, meaning the mechanisms of racial capitalism were forcibly engendered through Black women's labor, bodies, and reproduction. Women made up nearly half of colonial Haiti's enslaved population. While free women of color were often economically independent as traders, real estate owners, and at times as slave owners, African-born women especially were the backbone of the slave-based economy, laboring alongside men, cutting and processing sugarcane and working in coffee and indigo plantations. They were expected to work through and shortly after their pregnancies, and they were brutally mistreated, sexually or otherwise, when they rebelled or at the whims of plantation owners and managers. Just as racial capitalism is expressed through gender, we might also argue then that aspects of the Black radical tradition, which is the long-term struggle against systems of oppression that shaped life in the Americas, were also expressed in distinctly gendered ways. So there remains an opportunity to elevate a gendered analysis to our understanding of Black women's roles in rebellions, social movements, mobilizations, collective actions, and revolutions that span space and time, including the 18th century. I argue that if we want to begin to understand enslaved women's lifeways prior to, during, and after the Haitian Revolution, we have to interrogate the norms, values, behaviors, and roles that African women embodied in their homelands. By recovering African women's histories, we can piece together their economic, militaristic, political, and religious activities that predated and contributed to the revolutionary events in Haiti. Victims of the transatlantic slave trade did not just forget or abandon their African identities, beliefs, and practices once they disembarked in the Americas. Rather, they reassembled and reformulated what they knew and did in their homelands and translated these ideas and behaviors into a new context. For example, in the Dahomey Kingdom at the Bight of Benin, there was a military body of women called Ubeto, which you see depicted on the left here. And these women soldiers were referred to by outsiders as Amazons. From as early as the 17th century, these women soldiers served the king of Dahomey as elephant hunters and as his personal security and in warfare. Also in the Dahomey Kingdom and other West African societies, women were central politically and religiously, serving as queen mothers who counseled and advised kings and provided spiritual guidance for the kingdom. At the Central African coast, queens like Donna Beatrice and Nzinga not only headed their respective kingdoms, but also led movements to oppose the disruptive social, economic, and political forces connected to the transatlantic slave trade and European domination. Additionally, women in various African societies were the central spiritual figures such as healers and midwives, and they were indispensable economic producers who performed the agricultural labor that sustained their communities. This African perspective, therefore, is key when investigating women's roles in the Haitian Revolution as nurses, cultivators, soldiers, spies, and sacred authorities. So there are but a handful of women who appear in the historical archive as revolutionaries, but these figures were probably only but a few of the unnamed masses of women who may have taken up arms or otherwise actively struggled for their freedom. In order to fill in the gaps about these activities, we can look at the ways that they translated cultural and religious knowledge and practices into political power. The religious system, now known as Haitian Vodou, is based on human relationships to African and Haitian spirit forces who at times intervene in human affairs at the behest of adherents. Women are central figures in Vodou contemporarily as Mambo priestesses, whose presence is key to spiritual efficacy. Historically, enslaved women used their ritual practices and relationships to spirits to enhance the power of the revolutionary masses. So I've already mentioned one of the most well-known examples of this intersection between African-based religion and revolution as the Bois-Cayman ceremony, the gathering of rebels that occurred only 1 week before the August 1791 uprising. Oral histories and other early sources identified Cecile Fatiman as a Mambo or as a Vodou priestess and the main presider of the ceremony that sacralized the Haitian Revolution. Other Vodou queens like Princess Amethyst accompanied and offered sacred protections to the male rebels like Bukmandadi during the taking of Le Cap in that fall of 1791 as well. The 1791 uprising quickly spread throughout the colony, and by 1793, the rebels had freed themselves from bondage and formed a formidable army that repelled both Spanish and English forces, prompting French authorities to issue a general emancipation in exchange for the rebels having preserved the colony from enemy forces. Former slaves were then referred to as cultivators, who were to be paid for their work, free from violent punishments, supposedly, and were free to buy, sell, and consume the items that they produced. Or rather, they demanded to have the liberty to buy, sell, and consume the items that they produced. Women remained a core component of the agricultural force, especially as they were expected to help economically sustain the colony during the height of the revolution. And so in terms of making some of the demands around what this new labor regime would look like, women were also kind of central to the kinds of labor protests that appeared in southern Haiti, when women cultivators were opposing unfair working conditions and opposing unequal pay between themselves and their male counterparts. And there are also records alluding to women acting as spies, smugglers, and nurses for the male rebels. So although women were typically tied to the land and local plantations due to work, surveillance, and family, some women were able to navigate the colony's landscape, secure resources, and connect rebel armies across plantations. Scholars like Carolyn Fick have argued that women often took temporary leave and used their time to traverse plantations and spread the word and organizational plans for revolt. Since runaway Maroons are my area of interest, I'll discuss a few women, Charlotte Papillon and Magdalene, as well as Vida, whose partners were central leaders in the Haitian Revolution, including Jean-Francois, Hyacinthe Ducoudray, and Lemore Durant, respectively. Advertisements for both Charlotte and Magdalene suggest that these women escaped their owners in the months leading up to and after the August 1791 revolt and may have helped to organize the revolution. First, we see Magdalene, who escaped sometime in the summer of 1790 and was believed to have been accompanying Hyacinthe. So Hyacinthe was a ritual leader who in 1792 was at the head of 15,000 rebels in Croix-du-Bouquet near Port-au-Prince. Another primary source by Colonel Charles Malenfant indicated that women in Hyacinthe's camp commonly ran errands to exchange weapons and food. So we see Magdalene possibly fulfilling this role as a mobilizer before the Haitian Revolution uprisings. In this advertisement, Magdalene is also described as having transgressed gender norms by dressing in men's clothes, perhaps to not only disguise herself as a free person, but to conceal her active participation in organizing the uprisings that would later occur in the Western Department. Similarly, Charlotte, a woman of the Poulard Nation from Senegambia region, escaped the Papillon plantation in March 1791, 3.5 years after her partner Jean-Francois Papillon made his escape. It was suspected that Charlotte was abusing the temporary pass that she was given and had been moving about in different quarters. By the time the advertisement was posted, it was believed that she was in or around Port-au-Prince. We may never know exactly what Charlotte was doing between March and August 1791, the different parishes she visited, or with whom she was in contact. However, it may be possible that she left in the spring on behalf of Jean-Francois to help coordinate the rebellions that would begin a few months later. While Charlotte was traveling in the greater Port-au-Prince area, several smaller uprisings began there in July that anticipated the August mass revolt in the Northern Plain. By September, Charlotte was back north with Jean-Francois, and rebels at the former Galliffet plantation had named them king and queen. The election of kings and queens was common among the rebels whenever they gained military control of a parish. In such a case, we might think of Charlotte's crowning as a reward for her role in coordinating the Northern and Western revolts. Another, a lesser-known African Maroon leader, who was a woman named Vida, led forces alongside Maroon leader Lemore Durant, who incited the cultivators to rebel and also fought in against the French in the 1802 Leclerc expedition to reimpose slavery after it had already been abolished in the French colonies. So according to African-American abolitionist William Wells Brown, Vida was a native of Africa and had been ruthlessly torn from her native land. Her face was all marked with incisions, and small pieces had been cut out of her ears. Vida kept a horse, which she had caught with her own hands and had broken to the bit. When on horseback, she rode like a man. On arriving at places too steep to ascend, she would dismount and her horse would at once follow her. This woman, with her followers, met and defeated a battalion of the French who had been sent into the mountains. L'Amour and Vida united and made war on the whites whenever they found them. While Vida's place of origin is unclear, it is possible that she may also have been from the Bight of Benin, given the regional use of horses for combat and the military expertise of Dahomean women trained as soldiers there. So it would not have been implausible that Vida gained warfare training in her homeland, then utilized those skills later during the uprising. So partnership, as well as motherhood, are also lenses through which women become more visible in histories of the Haitian Revolution. In 1802, when Napoleon Bonaparte's armies sailed to the French Caribbean to reinstate slavery, the formerly enslaved women and men of colonial Haiti, who had become an armed military force proven in combat, continued their resistance struggle for absolute freedom from slavery and independence from colonial rule. Some women who were married to military officers seem to have participated in this struggle. According to C.L.R. James, at the Battle of Crête-à-Pierrot, an important turning point in the final struggle against French forces, Marie-Jeanne Lamartiniere accompanied her husband and, quote, took her share of the defense, end quote. On the other hand, Claire Héroux, wife of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, was sympathetic toward opposing forces and attempted to save some of the Frenchmen who were scheduled for execution. And I've already kind of mentioned Sanité Belair, who was also executed alongside her husband during this campaign. So the archival silences around women in the Haitian Revolution require careful investigation into the histories, African Atlantic histories, to restore those women's voices. On the other hand, it's also important to ask other questions about the place of women and even children during periods of social upheaval and transformation, such as what was the impact of that the revolution had on women and children. For example, several works, especially Black feminist historians like Jessica Johnson and Vanessa Holden, bring attention to enslaved women and girls' experiences as mothers, eyewitnesses, victims, survivors, and secret keepers during marronage efforts and other uprisings. Others such as of course, I just blanked on the person's name that I also wanted to cite. But they beg the question of how women and girls coped with trauma, violence, loss, and structures that commodified their being, but also with the structures of war that sought to liberate them. So the afterlives of slave rebellions saw waves of public horrifying acts of retributive violence that produced fear mourning, and the tortured afterlife of life, the tortured process of life making in the aftermath of death, processes that were deeply gendered. And here I'm referring to the work of professor at Emory University in their Black Studies department. She's a wonderful Black feminist scholar, historian, named Aisha Perry. So one unnamed rebel woman and her daughters were captured during the 1802 Leclerc campaign and were condemned to death. As they walked together toward their execution, the mothers consoled her crying daughters, encouraging them to rejoice, for your wombs will not beget slaves. As the mother of enslaved girls, the unnamed heroine's final declaration illustrated what must have been a life amounted to living in constant grief, fear, and anger that undoubtedly arose from having little to no protection from sexual violence or control over one's destiny or that of one's children. For her, death meant freedom from her own bondage and freedom from the reproductive labor of bringing new life into a world defined by unending work, violence, and death. This anecdote reveals how the formerly enslaved women of colonial Haiti viewed the Haitian Revolution as a source of liberation that would end their reality of slavery and coerced reproduction. The risk of sacrificing one's life was worth the ability to regain control over the intimacies of mothering and kinship. On the other hand, one of the most revered women from the revolutionary era was Dede Bazile, commonly referred to as Défilé La Folle. Dede Bazile's story is exemplary of the emotional labor, or what Christina Sharp conceptualizes as wake work, that women performed in the face of the revolution's traumatic and deadly struggle from slavery to freedom. Various accounts describe Défilé as a woman distraught with grief over the brutal assassination of Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Outraged by the excesses committed to his corpse, she found a sack, loaded it with his bloody remains, and carried it into the city cemetery, as Joan Diane outlines. In this political act of recollecting his remains, she symbolically, quote, invites men and women to rebuild the society that was becoming fractured by civil war. Défilé's allegiance to Dessalines was represented in religious chants and songs in his honor, as she had been a consistent presence in his military camp prior to his betrayal by surrounding officers. In addition to her individual support, Défilé herself lost 3 of her sons and 2 brothers in the battle at Fort Liberté. The psychological toll that these deaths inflicted earned her the disparaging nickname La Folle, or the Mad Woman, thus marginalizing the value of her life and her political actions. Défilé likely had been born and enslaved near Cap Français, or what is today Cap Haitian, and died in 1816 at approximately age 80. Though other details of her origins and early life remain mired in obscurity. Perhaps influenced by nationalist impulses during the US occupation, as Jana Brazil has argued, for some Haitian scholars, Défilé is elevated to Mother of the Nation because of her great sacrifices. Through her actions and losses, Défilé is viewed as a model after whom the women of Haiti should model themselves, a woman who sacrifices self and even her own children for the sake of birthing and protecting the nation. But as others, such as Sabine Lamour, have recently pointed out, this conceptualization of Haitian women as the potomitan, or the strong pillar that upholds her family, community, and broader society, erases the intersectional systems of oppression that engender Haitian women's economic precarity and need for communal support. Thus, Black studies and Black feminist perspectives on trauma, mothering, loss, and reproductive justice within the context of racial capitalism and colonialism can help humanize enslaved women in ways that go beyond traditional conceptions of resistance and revolt. So I will end here, and I look forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you so much. We do have a comment in the chat from Natalie. Yes, regarding Suzanne Louverture, Toussaint's wife, I believe she had a child before marrying Toussaint, and started and having, I think, 3 more kids. It would be great to know more about her background. Is there anything else we know?
To my knowledge, there are folks who are doing that research right now. On Suzanne Louverture as well as Marie-Louise Christophe, following the two families, well into the 19th century. I haven't had the opportunity to look into those archives just yet. And so my understanding of what happens to Suzanne Louverture is limited, but I do believe that Marie-Louise Christophe, and this might be more widely known, that she and her daughters eventually settled in, I believe they spent some time in Italy and then in the UK where they eventually settled. But yeah, that's a great question about Suzanne Louverture that definitely, deserves more investigation.
I'm personally, I'm struck by the story you tell of Dede Basile and the burying. I think it's such an assertion of things that we need to return to after war. We need to respect the dignity of our dead. We need to reestablish our culture, I guess, is a way of looking at it. Do you see that as part of her legacy?
Yes, absolutely. And like I mentioned, there's been some recent work by Sabine Lamour to kind of give that kind of reframing to the kind of to the political implications, thinking about the political implications of death, of burial, of creating community around those rituals of reclaiming the lives of the fallen and giving them dignity. So yeah, absolutely.
We have a question. Do you know of any historical fiction about the revolution that is fairly accurate?
Yes, and I'm trying to, there is a new book that just came out about Marie Christophe and their daughters, Queen of Exiles, a novel of a true Black Regency queen. I'll put the title of it in the chat.
Oh, great. Thank you.
It's fictionalized, but I think it does cite and use historical primary and secondary sources.
So one question that kind of has come up a lot in our office as we've been thinking and getting excited about this talk is how it is so striking to us that the Haitian Revolution does not get taught to the extent that other revolutions are taught. And yet, I mean, you make such a compelling argument for its, how revolutionary, for want of a better word, it was. What are your thoughts on that? How has it been in some ways subordinated to other revolutions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this, again, kind of broader silence around the Haitian Revolution itself kind of reaches back to the era of the event happening when, or reaches back to the era of the slave trade in general, where enslavers and colonists kind of essentially convinced themselves that the so-called Negro was, incapable of thinking, incapable of planning, incapable of being revolutionaries who would come together to fight for their freedom. So there was already this kind of pre-existing disposition of thought that didn't allow whites to see a revolution such as this as a possibility. And so that idea kind of continues as the revolution unfolds. And then when you think about the ways that the revolution kind of reverberated throughout the Americas, it was a shock to the Black and white world alike, right? Planters and plantation owners in Cuba and Jamaica and the United States are fearful of the implications of the reality of a Black nation. And enslaved Black people are inspired and hopeful for what this might mean for their futures of freedom. And so all of these kind of political changes were deeply, informing the way that writers were writing about and producing information about the Haitian Revolution. And then you get into the indemnity and the American occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934. And now we arrive to the time when, the most common phrasing or the most commonly known factoid about Haiti is that it's one of the poorest countries in the hemisphere, instead of having been the first free Black nation in the Americas. Right? So yeah, I think that, if we can not only find ways to kind of bring that history back, but also to help folks understand not only how the Haitian Revolution kind of transformed Caribbean history, but maybe also transformed North American history as well, might be a way for people to begin to engage more. For example, the Louisiana Purchase is an almost direct result of the Haitian Revolution, because the French were running out of resources, trying to fight and put down the Haitian rebels, and had to sell its North American territories to the United States in order to kind of compensate for some of those financial losses. So our histories are, intimately tied, even though we, like you said, don't necessarily learn these things when we should.
We have a comment and a question from Professor Cherno-Sase. This is great, thank you. Was your previous response an example of wake work? And could you say more about how women's wake work helps reframe a history of war and rebellion in terms of gender?
Sure. I mean, I think that, and the scholar that I was whose name I was trying to recall at Emory is Aisha Finch. And her work also has, on rebellion and women in Cuba, also helps to give a little bit more materiality to this reality, in the sense that, and we even see this today, unfortunately, that, in warfare, oftentimes the so-called collateral damage tends to be women and children. And even when men make up the majority of fighters, it's women and children who kind of have to, are tasked with picking up the pieces of kind of rebuilding what comes next, rebuilding life in the aftermath of the brutality and the violence. And so I think that the ways that thinking about that process as also playing a really important role in how we think about war, revolution, and rebellion, is really important, and kind of is grounded in this kind of Black feminist tradition that people like Christina Sharp and Aisha Finch are a part of, and are, I think, doing a great job of kind of drawing through lines from, historical to kind of contemporary examples to really think through, what is the meaning of these kinds of events, and how do we make sense of women's roles, given the constraints in society that may exist. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Anyone else have any questions you'd like to ask? Please do pop them in the chat. And I had one, I am full of questions tonight, apparently. So I had one more question about, of course, Old North is a religious site and a historic site. And I was very intrigued by the role of religion in the revolution and women's contributions in that particular intersection. Could you speak a little bit more to that, if it's not too massive a topic?
Yeah, so and I don't want to, essentialize religious practices on the African continent. But in terms of some of the principles that were common throughout various regions, the kind of overlap between the sacred and the political world seems to be like a common theme, where there wasn't necessarily a separation. You know, kings and queens and other political figures were in many cases themselves sacred authorities. They relied on other sacred authorities to, you know, give them advice about war or just about kind of managing society.
Right, quitte ça.
And so that I believe that some people may refer to it as an enchantment, that way of, or that worldview rather, of the world as having been imbued with spiritual power in nature, in human relations. All of these things are infused with spirits, you know, the spirit world. And so within that kind of a worldview, you know, women had power and were viewed as being equal counterparts to male figures. And so part of what I have been thinking about and, you know, hope to explore more in a, you know, future project would be, you know, just the ways that women's sacred power was also instrumental in rebel communities. So, for example, one of the main historical heroes, not necessarily of the Haitian Revolution, but of the colonial period, Francois Macandal, who was the rebel leader in the North, who had been a Maroon for 18 years. And he was accused and executed for having orchestrated a conspiracy to poison the whites throughout the Northern Plain in the 1750s. In looking at some of the sources around that conspiracy, most of the people who were involved were essentially women. Many of the people who, because, you know, many of the people who would have had access to the food and water sources that enslavers were using were women who worked within the domestic sphere. So on that hand, you have women kind of having kind of a practical role in terms of their access, but also having the spiritual and sacred knowledge around how to create these poison packets, what kinds of plants and materials and resources are needed to put them together, and then to charge them, so to speak, with sacred power.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, someone has popped a Library of Congress guide, Women in the French Revolution, Women in the Haitian Revolution, into the chat for those who are interested. And I want to say thank you, Professor Edens, for a really wonderful, fascinating talk. And I've learned so much tonight, and I'm grateful that you've given us your expertise and your time. So, and thank you. Yeah, and thank you everybody who joined us. If you came in midway, oh, we have someone raising their hand, but let me just finish this thought. If you came in midway, we will be sending out the recording. So please, you will be able to get the benefit of the entire talk. Adeline, you had raised your hand.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. I really thoroughly enjoyed this presentation. And thank you, Jane, for sending me the link. As soon as I got the link, I kept sending it to family and friends. This was extremely powerful, informative. I guess, thank you for sharing about all the contributions that women contributed in the Haitian Revolution. I guess my question is, how can we apply the lessons that we've learned to contemporary struggles for equality and justice, from what we've learned from these women, these incredible women and who were part of this Haitian Revolution that many of us had never heard of?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, some of the areas where I try to um, draw connections to, between the past and present are in the area of, reproductive justice, for example, where, we see enslaved women and maroon women, part of the ways that they attempted to resist their wombs and their fertility being used by enslavers was a range of things. On one hand, they used these kinds of herbal packets or other types of medicines to terminate pregnancies or to terminate pregnancies. On the other hand, some maroon women escaped with their children and opted to try their best to raise their children away from plantations. And so when I see those kinds of things, it makes me think of issues around reproductive justice today and how women, increasingly here in the United States, but across the hemisphere, and especially in the Caribbean and in Haiti in particular, where reproductive rights and freedoms are restricted. And for Black women especially, these kinds of things are dangerous when we look at the economic status of Black women, when we look at health outcomes, maternal health outcomes, and all of these other kind of measures around, health and well-being for mothers especially. So my maybe one little kind of sliver of seeing a connection there is, supporting women's rights to have children, and to raise those children in dignified ways, but also supporting women's rights to choose to not have children if that's their choice. And so thinking about reproductive justice in kind of a broad framework, I think is one way that we could support Black women globally.
Thank you. Anyone else before we wrap up for tonight?
Sorry, I so appreciate Adeline's question. When I did some research on the Haitian Revolution, I was just struck. I appreciate how Professor Eden said, this is the first successful Black revolution. And so this idea that it's never been done before doesn't mean it can't be done. And so I think there's a lot of inspiration in that for whatever struggle that we're fighting today, where it might seem insurmountable. And one of the ways that they won, one, there was just like, we're not going back. There's hell or high water, as they say, we're not going back, when Napoleon wanted to reinstate slavery after France had decided to abolish it. And then two was the guerrilla warfare. France was used to marching in straight lines on flat ground. They weren't used to the mountainous terrain of IET. And so they had an advantage. And so sometimes we have to look at what we might consider to be an underdog, or what we might consider to be a weakness, as our strengths. And to know that just because it hasn't been done before, it doesn't mean it can't be done.
It's a great comment. Thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you again, Professor Edens, for such a terrific and informative talk. And thank you all for being part of this evening. Really appreciated seeing you. All right. Good night now.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.